Welcome to the NCDWI Guide podcast, where defenders of the Constitution assemble to prepare for courtroom battle and firm owners gather to develop marketing strategies that will revolutionize the practice of criminal defense. Here's your host, the NCDWI guy, Jake Minick.
Hello, fellow freedom fighters, and welcome to another episode of the NCDWI podcast. Today we have on the program a very special guest, Anthony Palacios. Anthony is the CEO of Impaired Driving Specialists, LLC, as well as the standardized field sobriety testing and drug recognition expert consultant for the firm. Anthony is a former SFST state coordinator for the state of Georgia and a former SFST DRE staff instructor for the Georgia Police Academy at the Georgia Public Safety Training Center. Anthony is a former International Association Chiefs of Police certified DRE practitioner, DRE instructor, and DRE instructor trainer, as well as a National Highway Traffic Safety Administration SFST practitioner, SFST instructor, and SFST instructor trainer. While in law enforcement, Anthony trained approximately 3,000 city, county, state, and federal law enforcement officers and prosecutors in the detection of drivers under the influence of alcohol and drugs prior to becoming a SFST DRE staff instructor for the Georgia Police Academy. Anthony was one of the original members of his law enforcement agency's DUI task force. After serving almost 3 years on the DUI task force, Anthony was selected as one of the original members of his agency's fatal serious injury crash reconstruction team. Anthony has, just in my personal experience, trained every one of our attorneys at the office. Is got an incredible gift and knack for communicating the concepts that are in the SFST student course, the DRE course, the A-RIDE course, has got an incredible knack for communicating effectively to people of all different type of backgrounds, law enforcement and no law enforcement experience. And it is just a pleasure to have you on the program, Anthony. Thank you very much for coming and speaking to us.
Thanks for having me, James.
Anthony, I think one thing that I will say in terms of just before we kind of dive into the topic of the day, which is horizontal gaze nystagmus, is that on this particular subject, I think you have been, in terms of kind of the speakers that I've seen talk about this, one of the most ardent believers in horizontal gaze nystagmus in terms of its use and validity when it is being properly administered. And I think that that is something that has kind of made you unique, something that I've seen when I was in my SFST course. I want to say that there was 2 prosecutors in the course with us. There was maybe about 12 to 15 participants in the class. I've sent you reports in the past to take a look at, and you have had no qualms about pointing out things in those reports that have not been helpful in terms of my client's ability to put up a defense. So it's a really good place to come and learn, because I know that you're not preaching to the choir, so to speak. You're giving basically, here's what law enforcement officers are learning. Here's why these concepts are important. Here's what this research shows, and it's not, biased, or, here's what, the way to kind of undermine the HGN test where there's no ability to do that. You believe in the HGN test when it's appropriately administered, and so that's definitely the major reason in terms of why I wanted to have you come on and talk about that with us.
Absolutely. That's the way, in my opinion, it should be. Any type of consultant or expert witness to remain objective is, not only is it their role to let the attorney know the things the officer's done wrong, but also what the officers did correct.
Well, tell me, Anthony, just a little bit. We kind of, in the intro, it kind of refers a little bit to some of the amazing qualifications that you have in regards to horizontal gaze nystagmus. But just tell us a little bit about your background in both using and teaching horizontal gaze nystagmus.
Absolutely. I was first introduced to the HGN test and the standardized field sobriety test back in 1996 when I was a very young law enforcement officer. I went through the 3-day field sobriety student course as a patrol officer. Obviously, once I graduated the course, I started applying it during DUI investigations as a patrol officer. In 1998, I was assigned to the DUI task force, and myself and the other officers on the task force were sent through the 3-day field sobriety course again, just as a refresher because of the fact we'd be using the test pretty much nightly. Obviously, while on the DUI task force, I was administering field sobriety about on a nightly basis. In 2001, I went through the DRE practitioner course where I became a certified DRE. HGN is a very important test that is used in the 12-step DRE process. And then from there, I started taking the instructor route. In 2002, I went through the field sobriety instructor course, which enabled me to start teaching the 3-day field sobriety course, which obviously has to do with HGN as well. And then in 2003, I went through a DRE instructor, which also allowed me to teach the HGN test as well. And then in the fall of 2003, that is when I was hired by the Georgia Police Academy as a full-time staff instructor, and I was assigned to the traffic section. And myself and the other instructors taught all the NHTSA impaired driving courses.
And in terms of just beginning the conversation of horizontal gaze nystagmus, just maybe give us an overview of what that is. What is horizontal gaze nystagmus?
Well, the horizontal gaze nystagmus test is the first of the 3 field sobriety tests that officers use out in the field to help establish probable cause during a DUI investigation. Nystagmus, the third word in HGN, means involuntary jerking in the eyes. The driver does not know it's happening. So HGN stands for involuntary jerk in the eyes occurring as the eyes gaze to the side. And of course, the officer during the test is having the person gaze one way or the other.
And in terms of what causes horizontal gaze nystagmus, tell us a little bit about kind of what the causes of horizontal gaze nystagmus look like.
Well, when an officer goes through the basic field sobriety course, the primary focus is on alcohol. When a person gets to a certain BAC level, then the nystagmus becomes readily noticeable to officers. And the higher the BAC level gets, the more what officers call clues they're able to observe on a driver. Putting alcohol aside, there are also certain drugs that can cause nystagmus as well.
Okay. And in terms of horizontal gaze nystagmus being part of the student SFST course that officers are going through, this is one of the 3 standardized field sobriety tests. So talk a little bit about what it means for a test to be standardized and then how that is communicated in those different student courses to the people that are in the class.
Well, with the test being a standardized field sobriety test, that means there's 3 standardized elements to the HGN test. One of the standardized elements is the procedures, which is how the officer conducts the test. The other standardized elements is the clues, which is what the officers are trained to look for. And then the third standardized element is the scoring criterion, which is how the officer scores the test. So if the officers administer the HGN in the standardized procedure they're supposed to, then they'll be administering it the same time, the same way to every driver and interpreting the same clues and scoring the same clues to every driver out there.
And in terms of the kind of scientific method that led to horizontal gaze nystagmus being developed, what kind of original validation studies were conducted, and just give us a brief overview of those studies?
Well, briefly, there was 3 original development studies that were conducted, and they were conducted through years and years of clinical research and field studies by the Southern California Research Institute. And all these validation studies were funded by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, better known as NHTSA. The first study was conducted in 1997, which was a lab study only, and that was conducted in California. The follow-up study was done in 1981.
Just to interrupt you, what does a lab study mean?
A lab study is when all the development and all the testing is done in a controlled environment. Nothing's done out in the field. It's all done in a controlled environment in a laboratory setting.
Okay. And then the second study was done in the field, or it was also done in the lab?
Actually, they were the second study was both.
Okay.
That happened in 1981. That was also done in California. A portion of that validation study was done in a lab, and then a portion of it was done in the field. And then the last original validation study was done in 1983, and that was a field study only. That happened in Maryland, Washington, D.C., Virginia, and coincidentally enough, North Carolina. The North Carolina State Highway Patrol was part of the 1983 field validation study.
And in terms of those validation studies, what was kind of the general research that came out of those studies with regards to horizontal gaze nystagmus?
Well, the results that came out were pretty much the HGN test was an effective tool for officers to be able to use out in the field. It did not require any type of specialized equipment. And out of the 3 field sobriety tests, it had the least amount of limitation to it as far as environmental conditions, because it wasn't testing people's balance or coordination or anything like that. So, if for whatever reason a person was stopped on a gravel road to where maybe the walk and turn in one leg stand couldn't be used, HGN could still be used. And during the original validation study, it was found that HGN was the most reliable of the 3 field sobriety tests.
And in terms of the officers that were involved in those 3 studies, what was the experience level of the officers that were involved in those studies?
Well, during the 3 original studies, the officers' experience levels were pretty much non-existent. The field sobriety tests were obviously new at that stage, so the only experience the officers had with the field sobriety test was the minimal training they received from the scientist on how to conduct the field sobriety and how to interpret the field sobriety for the study. Prior to that, no officers had any type of field experience with the test because field sobriety wasn't created at that time.
And in terms of the utilization of the horizontal gaze nystagmus test coming out of this, what were basically the mechanics that came out of these field sobriety tests in terms of how to perform the horizontal gaze nystagmus?
Well, the mechanics that were established for the horizontal gaze nystagmus test specifically ended up being broke down into 10 specific standardized steps. And because of the test being standardized, the officers were required, and still are to this day, required to follow each one of these 10 administrative steps. The first thing, just a brief overview, the first thing an officer is required to do, step number 1, is if a person's wearing eyeglasses. The officer is going to have the person remove the eyeglasses. It has nothing to do with eyeglasses causing nystagmus or causing any type of false positive. Actually, the reason why officers have a driver remove the eyeglasses is because if they're kept, when the officer's performing the test, the eye could actually start jerking where the frame's at. And it would be hard for the officer to see the nystagmus. So step number one is very simple. Just have the driver remove the eyeglasses. The standardized step of number two is just setting the driver up in the instructional stance, which is nothing more than telling them, I want you to put your feet together, your hands down by your side. And then the officer is going to explain how the test is going to be performed. The officer is going to tell the driver, I'm going to put my finger or a pin in front of your face. Now I'm going to be moving it side to side. And what I want you to do is just follow it with your eyes and your eyes only, keeping your head still and straight. And of course, the officer is going to ask, do you understand? At that point, if the driver's following the verbal instructions, no other verbal instructions are given during the test. The next step is positioning the stimulus. There's a standardized distance and standardized height. The stimulus has to be 12 to 15 inches away from the person's face, slightly above eye level. And then the next two steps, step number 4 and step number 5, have to do with the medical assessment portion of HGN. Officers are required to assess the person to make sure they are proper candidates for the HGN test. So during the medical assessment, the officer's going to check for equal pupil size, resting nystagmus, and what's called equal tracking. And all that is the officer's going to start moving the eyes back and forth just to make sure when the left eye goes out one way, the right eye's tracking the same way. Once the officer medically assesses the driver, then they're going to start looking for the standardized clues, which is going to be step number 6, 7, and 8. The first clue, lack of smooth pursuit, the officer's going to start looking for that at a specific standardized time rate. The officer's then going to transition into checking for distinct and sustained nystagmus at maximum deviation, which again has a specific standardized time rate. And then the officer is going to check for the last clue, which is onset nystagmus prior to 45 degrees, which just like the first two clues, it does have a specific standardized time rate. Step number 9, the officer just totals up the clues in their head. And then of course, step number 10, the final step, the officer is going to check for vertical gaze nystagmus, which also has a specific standardized time rate as well.
And with those kind of specific time rates, I kind of think about horizontal gaze nystagmus as a inches and seconds specific test. And that's part of what was developed in the research and why there was this kind of standardized way of performing the test, because that was based in part on what they were seeing in their studies. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, that is correct.
And in terms of kind of some of the common difficulties or common mistakes that are made during some of those steps, so during that kind of step-by-step process, what would be some of those kind of common mistakes that a officer might make, either because of the field conditions or because of the kind of incorrect utilization of the training?
Well, it's kind of ironic that you kind of mentioned how you think of HGN in inches and seconds, because one of the most common mistakes I see with officers administering the HGN test has to do with the positioning of the stimulus. And usually it's an officer holding the stimulus too close to a driver's face or too high. Those are the two most common I see as far as positioning of the stimulus. The other most common mistake I see actually has to do with the time rates. As we've mentioned, each clue has specific time rates, and more often than not, when the officer deviates from these time rates, it's because they're making the passes too fast.
And I guess in terms of just kind of understanding why those things are important, in terms of holding the stimulus too close, too high, not following the specific time frames of each of the 3 standardized clues that come out of that test, what would be the kind of impact of those mistakes on the validity, and whether that's on the validity of the kind of entire test, so all 3 clues, or whether that's the validity of an individual clue?
Well, you almost answered the question. The impact of the validity of the test has to do with a specific mistake. As you asked, and as you mentioned, some mistakes will cause a specific clue to be unreliable, but the rest of the test is still reliable. For example, if an officer conducts the first check for lack of smooth pursuit too quickly, but then they conduct the rest of the test correctly, that specific clue, lack of smooth pursuit, would be unreliable. The validity would be no good for that clue. But distinct and sustained nystagmus and maximum deviation and onset of nystagmus prior to 45 degrees would still be reliable based on that one mistake. Now, the flip side of that is there are mistakes an officer can make that would invalidate the entire test. For example, the required medical assessment checks. If the officer omits one or all of the medical assessment checks or performs incorrectly, even if they administer all the checks for the clues correctly, the mere fact that they did not properly medically assess the driver would invalidate the entire test.
And I guess in terms of just the kind of you're having trained so many officers and kind of being involved in the learning process so many times, what do you think that a lot of that, kind of lack of proper conducting of the test is based on? Do you think that's based on poor training or poor follow-up training? Do you think it's based on the officers just not having enough opportunities to utilize the test in the field, and so it just kind of is not something that is top of mind when it comes to then trying to practice it? What do you think the reasons are for the mistakes that are made, and why that happens?
Well, I'll tell you, based on my experience as a field sobriety instructor in law enforcement, in my opinion, it's the fact that once officers leave the training, they're not utilizing the test enough out in the field. The horizontal gaze nystagmus test is not like riding a bike.
Right.
It does not come right back to you like riding a bike would. So unfortunately, what happens for a lot of these officers, if they're assigned to if they're a patrol officer and their primary function is to answer calls for service, they go through the basic field sobriety class, they learn how to do it correctly, they go back to their agency, and it may be a month down the road before they're doing a DUI investigation. And during that month, they have not administered HGN whatsoever. And it doesn't come right back to the officer. Versus an officer that leaves the training and they're assigned to a traffic unit or they're assigned to a DUI task force unit where they're constantly using the test about on a daily and nightly basis. It's all about muscle memory. And the more you practice it and the more experienced you get, the easier it is to administer the test.
And in terms of the studies that were done originally to verify or kind of help validate the utilization of horizontal gaze nystagmus, once that became kind of more common practice and utilized on a more national level, there have been additional studies that have been done to validate and test further horizontal gaze nystagmus use.
Yes, there has. NHTSA sponsored some field validation studies in the mid-90s. And one of the main purposes for those studies was because of the national per se law being changed from 0.10 to 0.08. Obviously, the field sobriety tests were validated for 0.10. So NHTSA wanted to make sure that the tests would still be accurate at a 0.08, which those field validation studies supported. Then, of course, in the 2000s, there was a study that came out specifically concerning HGN only. Had nothing to do with the walk and turn and one leg stand, just HGN.
And in terms of the study of the robustness of the horizontal gaze nystagmus test by Dr. Burns, that is a study that I see come up in court a lot. It's a study that I think is definitely very prominent in terms of when horizontal gaze nystagmus is at issue. What was kind of the basis of that particular research being done?
Well, there was three primary purposes for the robustness of HGN study. One of the purposes was to see if the HGN test would still be reliable with someone with vision in only one eye. Another main portion of the robustness of HGN test was to see if HGN would be reliable with a person in a different position other than standing, like lying down. And then, of course, one of probably the main portion of the HGN, or excuse me, of the robustness study was to see if deviations from the HGN standardized procedures would affect the reliability of the test. So during the study, officers were actually made to do HGN incorrectly to see if they'd be able to interpret the clues correctly.
Okay. And the officers that were used or kind of participated in that study, what was their experience level for the ones that participated in that robustness study?
Their experience level was extremely high when it comes to the standardized field sobriety test and HGN. And as a matter of fact, there was actually minimal requirements for officers in order to participate in the study. They had to be a traffic officer. They had to be a certified drug recognition expert. And they either had to be a field sobriety instructor or DRE instructor. So you're talking about a small percentage of officers out there that have a lot of experience in administering HGN.
And so in terms of the findings of that study, again, in terms of kind of a broad and general perception, what did that study show?
Well, this is where the study gets a little sticky, but I'll give you the 2-cent version. If you read the abstract of the study, according to Dr. Marcelina Burns, if an officer deviates from the standardized procedures, it's okay. It does not affect the results whatsoever. If you go past the abstract and you start actually reading the study and looking at all the data and all the results the officers recorded based on the person's the volunteer drinker's BAC level, the study actually showed that if the standardized procedures for the HGN test are deviated from, the results are unreliable, even when it's a highly trained and experienced officer conducting and interpreting the test.
And in terms of the, I guess if we call them concerns or kind of the findings, what in terms of the actual findings themselves would be kind of a grounds, again, in terms of not being consistent necessarily with this idea that if you deviate, it will not impact the reliability of the clues that you see?
Well, during the study, the scientists had the officers intentionally hold the stimulus too high, which was for the study 4 inches above eye level. They had the officers intentionally hold the stimulus too low, which was at the person's eye level. They had the officers hold the stimulus too close, which was 10 inches, and then too far, which was 18 inches. And based on those 4 experiments, the study showed that those deviations caused over a 50% false positive. Again, even using highly experienced officers. To be specific, when the officers held the stimulus too high, 4 inches above eye level, 61% of the time that officers were saying or scoring 4 or more clues, the volunteer drinker's BAC level was below 0.08. So that was a 61% false positive. When the officers intentionally held the stimulus too close, 69% of the time that these highly experienced officers scored 4 or more clues, the person's BAC level was below 0.08. So in my opinion, that study did nothing but support the manual at the time when the manual said, stick with the standards, don't deviate from the standards, and if you deviate from it, the validity is compromised. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, NHTSA did not use that study as a teaching opportunity and instead came up with other results.
One other question that I had, and maybe we can kind of conclude with this, is in terms of the utilization of horizontal gaze nystagmus in the courtroom. Have most of the horizontal gaze nystagmus studies that have been done been looking at using the clues that are seen on the test to determine a specific alcohol concentration or the probability of a specific alcohol concentration? Or are there any studies that have been used to show a person's impairment or kind of drunkenness level, if that kind of distinction makes sense?
It does make sense. And from the very beginning, from when HGN was first developed and validated, the scoring criterion always supported someone at a certain BAC level or higher. There's no studies that have validated HGN to impairment or someone's inability to operate a motor vehicle or anything like that. It's always been based on someone being at a specific BAC level.
Anthony, I appreciate very much you coming on and talking with us and kind of giving us a big picture idea of horizontal gaze nystagmus. To just, again, maybe give you a bit of a plug. I have learned more in my kind of limited time kind of doing the student course with you and follow-up courses, and I know the same is true of my team. I just back a couple months ago, watched you via a live stream on the National College of DWI Defense doing an informational seminar about A-RIDE, and again, in terms of just the training on the proper administration, instructions, utilization of the standardized field sobriety test, I don't think there's anybody better in the business than you in terms of teaching that. So appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us. And for everybody listening, if you are interested in really immersing yourself in being able to understand how an officer is supposed to be conducting a investigation when it comes to a DWI charge, this is the place to start by doing a student course, the same course that the officers go through, and being able to use that for the attack point. So, Anthony, thank you very much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
James, thank you for inviting me.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode of the podcast. If you did, please share the podcast with another freedom fighter in the criminal defense community, and be sure to leave us a rating on iTunes. See you next time.